This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
The Science Notes podcast on OAR FM Dunedin, brought to you by the Division of Sciences at the University of Otago. I'm Dave McMorrin. Over the next half hour, I'll be chatting with a graduate science student about their research, their passion for science, and the things that fuel their creativity. Well, welcome to Science Notes again for another time. My name is Dave McMorrin, and this week our guest is Briar Mills. Hi, Briar.
Kia ora, Dave.
So Briar is doing a Master's in Human Nutrition.
Yep, a Master of Science.
A Master of Science in Human Nutrition at the University of Otago. And even though you might think a Master's in Human Nutrition might be all about making new types of interesting food and things that taste interesting, in fact, you're doing almost the opposite. You're interested in what happens to the food when we don't eat it, aren't you?
Yes, I've been looking at food waste, particularly coming out of the University of Otago's residential colleges.
All right, so this is what we're going to be talking about tonight. But before we get into the nuts and bolts of what you've been doing, how is it that you found yourself, I assume, wearing gloves, standing over rubbish bins in a residential college?
That's a good question. And that is what I was doing. I did spend some time sorting through some rubbish bins. So I did my undergraduate degree at Otago as well. In 2019, I was a resident at Studham College.
Right.
And I remember living there with my friends and having discussions about, at the time, what we did when we finished dinner was we'd take our plates and we'd scrape whatever we had left into a bin, and then the plates would go through the dishwasher.
The bin would magically disappear.
Well, yes. And I remember you could see the waste building up in the bin over the course of the day as everyone added to it. And I had friends who sometimes wouldn't like a meal and would throw the whole thing out. And I remember having conversations with some of my friends about the food waste that we were contributing to, particularly coming from living at home where we would put all our leftovers into containers and save them for lunch the next day. And,
or potentially into a compost bin out the back.
Yeah, things that couldn't be eaten would go to the dog or the compost. And so throughout my undergraduate degree, I majored in human nutrition and minored in consumer food science. And some of the papers that I took had some kind of sustainability components, and there was discussion about food waste. And then I was originally going to complete an audit of the food waste at the residential colleges for it was kind of a summer studentship, but it would have been in semester one, so more of an autumn studentship. But then that was 2022, and there was a big COVID wave, and the residential colleges kind of said, or they increased their safety precautions, and my supervisors were kind of like, we're not super keen on me going into that situation. But I was still really interested in looking at the food waste at the colleges, and so it kind of and the university still wanted the data to inform their practice.
Okay, so you're actually doing this at the bequest of the university as much as it was your supervisor.
Yeah, so one of my supervisors is Dr. Ray O'Brien, the head of sustainability. And so it was, he provided kind of the context and lots of the ideas, and then I had academic supervision from Professors Sheila Skeef and Miranda Morosa, who have more of the food waste knowledge. Yeah.
So the Masters then is 2 years, and so when did you start the Masters officially?
So I started in August 2022, and I submitted my thesis a couple of weeks ago on the 31st of July, 2024.
And so then food waste is an issue. I mean, I suppose we all kind of vaguely know what this means, but in the little bit of reading I was doing before we met, it seems like it's a huge issue both in New Zealand and around the world, but also it's an issue that's very hard to put numbers on.
Yeah.
And as scientists, we like to put numbers on things, but it's a hard thing to measure. Yeah.
Yeah. So there are all sorts of components to it that make it confusing. So there are estimates that between 30 and 40% of the food produced globally is wasted, which is, I find it incomprehensible, the amount. But it's hard to measure and it's hard to define what is food waste. So many organisations working in the food waste sphere have different definitions. So, for example, when you are eating a kiwi fruit, the kiwi fruit skin, I eat it.
So
do
you
I. Eat it?
Of course I do. It's the best bit.
Yeah.
Almost.
but not everyone does.
No, but my wife doesn't. No.
Yeah. So is that food waste?
Yeah. Yes.
And then there are things like bones. If you're having a lamb chop for dinner, you can't eat the bone even if you wanted to.
That's what the dog's for.
Yeah. And so is that food waste?
Yeah.
If it goes to the dog, is it food waste even though it's going to the dog? There's like the cherries left on the tree at the orchard that got picked by the birds. Is that food waste?
Yes.
So it's hard to define. And so two terms that are used are food loss and food waste.
Yeah.
So food loss tends to refer to food that is not consumed from earlier in the supply chain, whereas food waste comes from kind of retail and households and wholesale.
Yeah. Because, of course, the food loss is something which I think is becoming more recognised as a thing now, because I feel like there's more recognition that when you go to the supermarket to buy a carrot, the carrot's supposed to look a certain way, and if the farmer grew the carrot and it didn't look that way, it just gets chucked out.
Yeah.
And never even makes it to the supermarket because we apparently require all our vegetables and fruit to look a certain way.
Yeah, and there's lots of work going on in that space, like academic research and things, but also work from the supermarkets, like Countdown with their Woolworth, their wonky Odd Bunch. Is that Odd Bunch where they?
Yes, it's one of them. Yeah. And, you get the funny looking stuff.
Yeah, just trying to change consumer perceptions that just because the apple might have a dimple doesn't mean it's not perfectly edible and just as tasty.
Yep.
But yeah, so it's hard to define it, and there's an ongoing debate about inedible and edible and unavoidable and avoidable food waste. So here in New Zealand, the Office of the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor has recently wrapped up some work on food waste, and there have been some recommendations come out of that. And the Ministry for the Environment has also generated or produced a definition for food waste in Aotearoa.
Which is an important first start, right?
Yeah.
Because once you have a definition, then you can start measuring against that.
Yeah. So a few years ago, one of my supervisors, Miranda Morosa, produced a report for the government about food waste, and she set out some recommendations, including getting a baseline measurement of food waste in New Zealand and setting a definition so that, once we've got a definition, we can figure out the scope and kind of start to track it at least a little bit.
A little bit.
Yeah.
And so this is where you come in.
Yeah.
Because you're doing a little bit of that.
Yeah, so my research has been a tiny little piece in a very big puzzle. So there's also been some work done at the University of Otago that's being commissioned by the government looking at getting a baseline measurement of food waste in New Zealand, where they've been taking data that they've found from across the supply chain.
Yep.
And they took some of my data to look at kind of the food waste coming from residential colleges.
Yeah. I mean, this report that I was reading earlier, where it was referencing any research done in New Zealand, it all seemed to be coming out of Otago, and I'm guessing it's all coming out of your group.
Yeah, so we have the Food Waste Innovation Research theme, which has been, I think it was set up in 2020, and it's there are three kind of themes within that. There's metrics and management, there's social innovation, and there's technical innovation.
Yeah.
It's a really interdisciplinary group or multidisciplinary. We've got research staff from across the university, lots of students like myself, and then also external collaborators. So there are people doing research at other universities and organisations and things around New Zealand, but I think Otago is definitely where it's happening.
Right. So the idea then was that you were going to measure how much food is being wasted by the students in the colleges.
Yes, so
how do the colleges work? So before you get to, how do the colleges work at the university? For those listening who may not know, because this isn't something that you find at every university the way we do it here at Otago. So how does that work?
Yeah, it's something that I think the University of Otago prides itself on its collegiate system. So we have about 14 residential colleges. 10 of them are owned by the university and 4 of them are owned externally but closely associated with and affiliated with the university. And they are home to around 3,500 students who are primarily first-year students. But there are some...
It's about 75-80% of all the first years?
Yeah, it's very... I think
it's most.
It's most first years, yeah. And even students whose hometown is Dunedin often these days go to residential colleges.
Couldn't when I was a student, but you can now.
Yeah. my father didn't. He was from Dunedin and he didn't go. But yeah, most students live in the residential colleges. And so that's home for them for the year. And as part of that, they're fully catered. They offer 3 meals a day. And as part of offering 3 meals a day, they also produce the waste from 3 meals a day. Yeah. So
the question then was how much is being wasted? And so that involved you going in and looking at the aforementioned tubs of plate scrapings that you made when you were a student yourself.
Well, not those exact ones, but that wouldn't have been very pleasant a few years later. So I spent 3 days at each of the 14 residential colleges, 2 weekdays and a weekend day to try and get a broad view. And I measured preparation, servery and plate waste, so not just the students' plates, stuff coming from the kitchen as well, from all 3 meals, breakfast, lunch and dinner. I spent about a month, 6 weeks or so, sorting through rubbish bins at all hours of the day.
So was this just like the leftover potatoes and peas and stuff from the dinner, or was it also solid waste from like soft drink bottles and that sort of stuff, or was it, well, I suppose not bottles, but because it's not food, but apple cores and stuff that might have been going in other rubbish bins? Or
so I just took the bins from the kitchens and the kitchen area. I think we did discuss a little bit that there might be food waste in other parts of the college, but we thought it was a bit of potentially an ethical issue going through rubbish bins from students' bedrooms. And also I wasn't super keen on sorting through all of that.
For fear of what else might be in the rubbish bins.
And we thought that the majority of the food waste was in the dining room anyway. And I think lots of the colleges have rules that food should really only be consumed in the dining room, depending on how closely they're followed. So the preparation waste, everything from when they were cutting up the vegetables in the morning, and then servery waste, so leftover trays of potatoes or lasagna.
That was never served in the first place.
Yeah, that was never served. And if it was going to be put in a fridge and reheated later, then I wouldn't count it. But if it was going in the bin, then I would sort through it. And then, all the waste off the students' plates, the apple cores, the stew that they didn't like, the biscuits, the muffins, the bread rolls, everything.
So if it all ends up in a big bin, so would you go through it and separate it all out and weigh it?
Yeah, so I had lots of tiny little bowls and I had some good rubber gloves and I would grab a handful and sort it out and kind of separate it as discreetly as possible. So there were some categories and things that I brought into my analysis later, but when I was developing my methodology, we thought it would be best if I sorted it as discreetly as possible, because I could always categorise it later, but I couldn't go back and see that actually the bread was entirely wholemeal bread crusts rather than bread rolls or white bread slices or whatever. Yeah.
So it sounds like lots of fun.
I did enjoy it. Some people, when I'm talking about it, some people kind of screw their noses up, but I enjoyed it. And I think I was doing it on the day that the waste was produced, and within an hour or two, it was all fresh there were a couple of things that they found in the back of the fridge that I blocked my nose for, but for the most part it was fresh, and so it wasn't particularly disgusting. Is there a consistency in the sorts of food that is served across all 14 of the colleges? Yeah, so they're all the 10 university-owned colleges are all on the same page, and I think their menus are pretty similar. Right. The 4 university-affiliated colleges are a little bit different and have some different suppliers and things, which is something that I looked at, if there was much of a difference, because they tended to their vegetables came less prepared. So when the university-owned colleges got a bag of onions that were diced and just thrown in the frying pan, right, the affiliated colleges sometimes had whole onions, and so they had onion peels and roots and things. Yep. So there was a bit of a difference that wise. But in terms of the menu, I don't think it's always the same thing at College A for dinner as it is at College B, but the types of foods are pretty similar. Yeah. Okay. So what then did you find? So I found that on average there's about 170 grams of waste per student per day, which multiplies out to about 160 tonnes from across the colleges every year. Which is a lot. Yeah. It is. In the scheme of all of the food waste in New Zealand, it's a tiny proportion, but it's still 160 tonnes of food going to landfill, which is 160 tonnes more than would in an ideal situation. And what proportion of that is coming from the plates? Pretty much half. About half is just food that the students are taking but then not eating. Yeah. And so some of that is bones. So when I was at one college, they had, I think they had ribs for dinner, and so that was quite a heavy day. Yeah. But yeah, so some of it is that, but the majority of it is just they didn't like it, or they took too much, or different things like that. Yeah. Yeah. And so what happens to the food then? That if they don't eat it? So the food off their plates goes in the bin, and at the moment it is going to landfill. Right. Though there is some work going on to kind of look at diverting that, and that's I also did some focus groups with staff and students. Yes, you did. Yeah. And sending it to pigs or composting or other alternatives like that were things that the staff and the students across the board seemed pretty interested in. When you talked to the students and said about the food they were throwing out, were they assuming that it was going to landfill, or were they assuming that there was university compost bins or something? Or I think they knew that it was going to landfill. I did my focus groups. It was kind of October, November by the time I did that. So there were some of the students did say that earlier in the year when they'd arrived, they'd assumed it was going to compost or something like that. But yeah, at the moment, there's just too much to send to landfill. And it's hard because there's meat and bones and cooked things and things that like worms don't like all mixed in. And you can't really have ginormous kombucha buckets or something. Yeah. So that would require an amount of separating things out. Yeah, and paper towels and the number of knives and forks that I found that people had accidentally put in the bin. Oh my gosh. And I found a whole dinner plate that they must have just been talking to their friend and dropped their plate in the bin and then ran away. Yeah. And not realised or It's easy to say, we should just compost the food waste, but it's in practice, it's a bit more complicated that's the trick, isn't it? And so I suppose if you're going to try and make a case for doing that, one of the key things you need the data. Yeah. Which is what you're busy doing, is trying to get that data. Yeah. I suppose it's also going to be something that's of interest to the kitchens because they're not going to be wanting to make food that's just going to go to waste. Yeah. So your sort of information, I mean, presumably they have a sense already of what the students like and what they don't like and what to cook and what to not cook, but also how much to cook. But was there a lot of food that just wasn't being eaten that the information may then inform the kitchens about how much they're making? Yeah, there was some. I think from the staff focus groups, there were some mixed opinions, and so I talked to kitchen staff, and I also talked to kind of college management staff, and the kitchen staff seemed to think that they had a pretty good handle on it. They said that they did take their forecasting, like one of the kitchen staff commented that, if it's a sunny day, they know that they're going to get less people for dinner because everyone's having takeaways at the beach or something. They know that they have smaller numbers, and so they do reduce what they're cooking for. But there was also discussion about how there is variation across the colleges, and maybe some more consistency in forecasting could be beneficial.
Did the student, based on your talking to the students, do they like the food? Is not an issue of them just not liking the food?
Well, it depends. They definitely, I think for the most part, they enjoyed it. There were a few dishes that they said they didn't like, but the kitchens continued to cook, and so I think that's another thing, increasing the communication between the students and the kitchen staff, because if no one likes lasagna, but they still make lasagna once a week, it's a bit of a feedback loop.
Yeah, but I suppose too, as you say, most of the colleges are full of first-year students, so this is their first time that they haven't had their mums and dads cooking for them.
Yeah.
And so there's probably an adjustment there too to...
And it's also when the colleges range in size from 120 residents to around 500.
Yes.
And when you have 500 people from 500 backgrounds and so many cultures and so much diversity, you can't please everyone all the time.
That's right.
I think the kitchen staff have a very difficult job, and they do it pretty well.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, everything I've heard from students is that the food's very good. And
and
when I've been to colleges for dinners for various things, the food's always been great. So, yeah.
Well, I also have a job on the side giving tours for prospective students around the university, and we do go through a couple of the colleges, and I always say, the food's pretty good. There were a couple of things that I didn't like when I was in first year, but Mum and Dad used to make things that I didn't like as well.
Right.
It's...
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I suppose that's a big part of this whole food waste thing, isn't it? Is a lot of it comes down to people's own opinions about what they like and what they don't like. And
yeah, I think that was something that came up in the focus groups a bit. If the students don't like it, they're going to waste it more, kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you've handed in. Mm-hmm. So what next for you?
So I am planning on turning my thesis into a paper through the writing bursary. So I'm going to, my sister lives in sunny Nelson, and I'm going to go there for a few months to work on that.
Nice.
And I'm not quite sure what's happening after that. I'm applying for a few jobs here and there.
In a similar sort of field, or?
A bit all over the place. Food waste isn't hardcore nutrition science.
No.
It's really interesting, and I like that it's a mix of food and nutrition and sustainability and that sort of thing. But I am interested in nutrition as well. So it's finding that. And so I'm not opposed to spending more time working in the food waste space, but I'm also interested in lots of different things. Yeah. And I think, I'm open to lots of
any
options.
PhD scholarships people want to offer you.
Well, I'm not ruling out a PhD, but I want to take a break from study before I do that.
Fair enough too.
Yeah.
Well, we're just about out of time. Thank you, Briar, for coming in and talking to us about what you've been up to.
No worries. Thank you very much.
And all the best for what comes next.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Kia ora.
You've been listening to the Science Notes podcast, brought to you by the Division of Sciences at the University of Otago. To listen again, or to find other episodes in this series, go to Otago Access Radio's website, oar.org.nz, or to your favourite podcast platform.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.